Hey guys, another developer video for you. I wanted to touch on Z order handling with spawners. By default, spawners are designed to spawn the creatures or items on multiple Z levels. And this is correct behavior and what you expect. For instance, here we have a single spawner up on the catwalk at Cove. And if I was to set this to, say, a home range of 17 and like 30 mobiles, you would expect them to spawn not only on the catwalk but on the ground as well, and underneath the catwalk if that's a spawnable area. So let's just see what that looks like. So we've got gypsies on the catwalk, gypsies down here on the ground. We've probably got some underneath because these are all spawnable locations, and it's the normal default behavior for a spawner. But sometimes you don't want this behavior. You want things to spawn at a particular Z, and that's easy enough to do. So let's set our count here to 1 so it's easy to see. Okay, so we got a count of 1, and we're going to set the home range to say 4. All right. Now, if we were to leave things as the default, let's just take a look and see what that happens. Okay, he's on top. That's good. He's on top. Okay, he's on the ground. Don't really want that. Up on top, on the ground. And now he's underneath the catwalk. All right, now this is still correct behavior. So when you want to enforce a certain Z, then you're going to go over here to spawner flags. Spawner flags has a couple of options. We can ignore most of these, but force Z is of interest to us. When I get done with this demo, I will talk about the others briefly while we're here, but let's just do force Z. And so I think it's obvious that when you force a Z, you're ensuring that the mobile will spawn at the same Z as the spawner. Okay? So let's do that. All right, he's up here at the same Z as the spawner. All right, so that's all that's required. Okay, if you want to get things spawning on a catwalk like this, you just set force Z. So that's the end of the Z order demo. But while you're here, let's talk briefly about some of these other flags. They're a little bit more interesting. You typically won't be using them, but for instance, spawn far. You'll use that if, let's say, you're spawning, 100 mongbats. And if you think about a circle, the area of the circle becomes smaller as you approach the center. That is the spawn radius. So you have a higher concentration in the center. You might have an even distribution from the center point out to the edge, but if you were to count the mobiles, 5 tiles from the center, you're going to have a denser concentration. What spawn far does is try to more evenly distribute the mobiles away from the center. So while you'll still have the same number of mobiles, a player coming into the area won't feel like they hit this, cluster around the spawner. Okay, so it's sort of a declustering mechanism. Boat is special. It just means that your mobile can spawn on a boat. I use it internally for certain things. You'll typically not use it, but boats are usually excluded from valid spawn locations. This simply means that yes, you can spawn on a boat. Avoid players. I use this one quite a lot. When I'm spawning creatures, I typically don't like them just to magically appear in front of a player. So if I'm spawning gypsies over a 30 tile radius, I will try to avoid those locations where I'll be spawning right in front of a player. So when I'm picking my spawn points, I look to see if there's a player right there in eye shot, and if there is, I'll just go pick another place. In the end, if I can't avoid players, then I'll just pick one of the places near a player. I won't give up, but the idea here is to come onto the screen, come into the world as innocuously as possible. Force Z, we just talked about that. Clear path, again, you probably won't use it. It's a little bit more expensive. But I use this in cases where I want a path from wherever I spawn the mobile back to the spawner. Okay, so if I used clear path here and I was throwing these mobiles out off the catwalk, clear path would fail a lot of the time, and it would only spawn the ones on top of the catwalk. That's because the ones on the ground do not have a clear path back to the spawner. Typically not important. I use it for treasure map locations, the treasure chest locations. Since I distribute, like 2,000 treasure chests, it's very hard to know in a programmatic way how valid that spot is. So one of the techniques I use is to make sure that, since spawner locations were hand picked and placed in places where a player can get to and walk, I use that to decide where to put treasure chests. If the treasure chest has a clear path back to the spawner, then I know that players can get to the treasure chest. Okay? Again, a little bit esoteric, not something you'll be using a lot, but knowing why it's there and how it's used is helpful. No block is maybe a little bit obvious. Essentially, it's saying if the mobile you're spawning is going to end up in a blocked location, circled with blocking objects, it cannot walk out or cannot walk away, then I'll try to avoid that spot. And I think I use something like 4, 6, 8, 10 tiles, some number. The mobile that spawn needs to have that much free movement. I'll use this sometimes in dungeons, so when I'm spawning a creature, it doesn't end up in a blocked location where players can't get to it and it can't get out. Okay? Concentric is related to spawn far, but not really. It uses some sophisticated math to more evenly distribute spawn. So when I'm spawning, 2,000 reagents over, a couple hundred tiles, like spawn far, I don't want them all clumping at the spawner, but I also want an even distribution. Concentric spawning is more expensive. There's a lot more math involved, but it does a much better job of even distribution across the area. Okay, allow Z change is sort of the opposite of force Z. It just allows you to spawn on multiple Z levels. The one difference is, though, that you may have noticed that allow Z change wasn't checked by default. That's because by default, creatures can spawn anywhere from their Z on down. They won't spawn up a Z, right? They won't spawn up to the next Z level. Allow Z change will allow you to do something like, let's say you were to put a spawner in the West Britain Bank and you checked allow Z change and you gave a distance of 10 tiles or whatever. You could spawn things on the roof even though the spawner is inside the bank. So allow Z change allows positive Z above the spawner, not just at the same level or below. Again, this one is rarely used. I used it for the siege invasion at Shard launch because those creatures were in fact spawning on appropriate rooftops in various strongholds and whatnot. So useful to know. Probably don't use it because if it's not what you want, you're going to get some results which are less than desirable. Okay, so that's it. So Force Z is probably the one you guys will Force Z and Spawn Far and Clear Path and No Block are all pretty useful, but Force Z is probably your go-to option here when you're trying to get things to spawn at the same level as the spawner, especially in a situation like this with a catwalk. Okay, that's it. I hope this was helpful. I'll put it in our library of developer tips. Bye.